Hello, this is Philosophy 74, and this is week 5, right? For us, week 5, we start the new section, new part of the class, part 2. Uh, and The title of this part is Happiness, Excellence, Dependency, and Care. So we finished part 1 on the distinction between ethics and the law, right? We saw Socrates and Plato, we saw Sophocles' Antigone, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and then Immanuel Kant, right, um, on the metaphysics of morals. So, what I want you to keep in mind about, we are reading Aristotle in this part, this week, week 5, and then next week, week 6. We are doing Aristotle, three books from the Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, right? And then we move on to the question of care, dependency, okay, on in week 7. So, we are doing these three books, right? And what I want you to do, I mean, for this week, read especially the highlighted passages, but not only. Read the sections, read chapter, book, sorry, books 1 and 2, and then next week we'll continue with book 2 and also look at book 3, okay, of the ethics, okay. So then what I want you to consider first of all is I will give you some conceptual framework that Aristotle doesn't necessarily elaborate here, but it is applied to the ethics as well, but it is present throughout his work, right? I mean, again, I had to be brief, simplistic. This is very sketchy as always, but you see at the beginning of the ethics, right, that Aristotle, and actually, uh, the title for this week today is Aristotle and the idea, right? The idea of the good life. That's what you find in the syllabus, right? So this idea of the good life is important, right? I mean, it is the same. The good life is different from simply life. It is the same as happiness that we will speak more about in a moment. But you see that at the beginning of book 1, right, the first chapter, Aristotle precisely says that that everything has an end, right? And in the sense of a goal, right? An aim. There is an aim. And the end, right, is also the good of something. Okay, so this is true whether you consider natural phenomena, nature in general, or any other situation, as Aristotle says, right? I mean, every craft and every line of inquiry, and likewise every action and decision seems to seek some good. Okay, so this good is the end. All right, so again, if we think about that in say nature, growth, right? I mean, the acorn becoming a plant, the seed becoming a plant, a child becoming an adult, and so on and so forth, a caterpillar changing, right, becoming a butterfly. That is the end, right? Telos in Greek, but in any case, we can speak much about that here. But at this end, which is also the good. Okay, so this is also the case when we engage in whatever activity, right? I mean, we aim at something, right? That which we are aiming at, right? The reason for right doing some, that's the end. So for example, we go to school to graduate, right, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so you see that there is here a pass, I mean, there is a similarity, an identity really between the end and the good of something. So the question then will be, what is the end of life? Okay, the end of life cannot be, so the end here is not seen, right? And as the final moment of something, right? But it is that for the sake of which something is done, okay? So what is the end of life? The end of life cannot be that. I mean, that is, yes, the end of life in a biological sense, that is the final moment, but that is not why we engage in all of the activities that we engage in, and we do all the things that we do. I mean, again, we don't go to class just to wait for the end of it, right? We go, for example, to class to learn something, to study something, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, the end is that for the sake of which something is done. So what I want you to consider also is these two very important concepts in Aristotle. There is also a passage. So on the one hand, think about this right relationship between the end and the good of something. On the other, also keep in mind this framework, okay, this logic, this passage which is always there between potentiality and actuality, the potential and then what becomes actual, okay? So it's always at work for Aristotle. Okay, something is potent. For example, right? I mean, the caterpillar is not a butterfly, but it is a butterfly potentially, right? Then at one point it will become the butterfly. The seed is not the plant, but potentially it is. It will become. A child is not an adult, but potentially the child is. The child will become an adult, and so on and so forth, right? So there is this passage from potentiality to actuality. At one point you will have the actual butterfly, the actual plant, the actual adult, right? And so on and so forth, okay? So this type of potentiality, okay, for the sake of uh, teaching for an analytic from an analytic point of view, let's say that there is potentiality. I call it potentiality number one and potentiality number two, about which I will speak in a moment. Okay, potentiality number one is precisely what happens in nature and so on. It is the potentiality that includes necessity, right? A must, okay? Something happens because it must happen, right? The child grows because and becomes an adult because that must be the case. It must be that way, right? The caterpillar must change, mutate, and become a butterfly, and so on and so forth. There is necessity, there is a must, okay? But there is another type of, there is another plane, right? The plane, if you will, of human action or other situations when, where, this potentiality is still there, the passage from the potential to the actual is still there, but it is not, it doesn't contain, it doesn't include necessity, but rather contingency, right? I mean, it is the potentiality, let's call it number two, okay, one, two, where you have, instead of a must inside, you have, so to speak, a can, right, or could. Something can happen, it can also not happen. Something could be the case, it could also not be the case. Okay, for example, the child that who must become an adult, the same child can or cannot, may or may not, right, become, could or could not become a lawyer, a musician, a baker, a driver, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, that is in a sense the realm of the plane of human action, okay, and this is what ethics is about, okay. So still, again, I hope this is clear, the same framework is there. There is always an end. The end is the good, okay. So the end, and you will find these examples in Aristotle's Ethics. He always gives examples that are extra moral, ethical examples to make the point, right? For example, the end of a medicine, the end of a the medical profession, medical science is to cure and prevent illnesses. But the end of engineering, architecture is to build houses, bridges, and so on and so forth, right? So, by the way, there is here, let me say, parenthetically, and you will find that in book one of the Ethics, a distance, a disagreement between Aristotle and his right teacher Plato, for whom there was only one good with a capital G, right? And we spoke about this briefly. But there are as many goods as there are ends, right? Again, at the end of medicine is different from the end of engineering, architecture, from the end of or any other thing, right? I mean, so each activity has an end which is different, which is specific to the activity, and so the good also must be different. But in any case, this is always in place. The end equals the good, right? So is it possible then that there is no end and no good to life? So what is it? So what I want you to think about particularly, okay, because we can't go, but read the whole again for now, book one and then book two also that we do between this week and next week. But focus on chapter 7, right? In book 1, chapter 7 is very important when Aristotle says, well, in order to find out what this right good is, happiness ultimately, because happiness is the same as the good life, okay? The good life, which is different from a mere life or a bare life, okay? So, in order to find out what this is, why happiness, the good life, and so on, we have also to understand, ask the question as to what the human function is, or human work, right? What is the function that we have, the work, the task that we have insofar as we are human beings. So not insofar as we are teachers, bakers, lawyers, drivers, and so on and so forth. I mean, every activity, every say profession, job, and so on has a function, just like the body. Aristotle himself says, right? I mean, any part of the body, the eye, has a function which is different from the function of the hand, right? So, what is the function of the human being as a whole and as such? Okay, so what is it that I have to do insofar as I am a human being, right? So again, the answer, I hope that I made this clear, the answer to this question is that the human function, by the way, function that you find in the book is I say this in Greek is ergon, E-R-G-O-N, ergon. If you think of it in English, there are words that come from that Greek word, like ergonomic, right, which means something that functions well, an ergonomic chair, right, I mean, and so on and so forth, right? You can check that on Google as well, see the picture of what that means, right? That there is, it is something that is really effective, the function in the most effective way, right? So, what is the human function? It is, he will say, and the activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Activity of the soul, pay attention, because soul, right, is psyche, right? Really, in Greek we translate it as soul. It's not it's not the immaterial soul of theological traditions. It is the psyche activity. It is an activity of the psyche of the soul in accordance with reason, meaning we do things with some intention. We do things because we are aiming at something, right? So there is a reason ultimately for the things we do, and however, then this is the technical definition of the human function, the human work, what it is to be, a human being. But then also, from the ethical point of view, this human function must also be in accordance with virtue, virtue, okay, virtue, which is then going to be important, as we will see in book 2 as well, very important in the ethics, or to the point of excellence. Excellence is another word for that, okay. So in accordance with you know correct reason, right? Because we can use reason also to do something terrible. I mean, it has been done throughout history, right? At the individual collective level. So the point is not simply to use reason to do something in a rational way, but to do it also with a sense of ethical, if you will, correctness, right? And that means, excellence. And so, activity of the soul in accordance with reason, actually, your version of Aristotle will say, right? I mean, again, chapter 7 of book 1, at one point he says, presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude. So we have asked the question, of the function of man. He says man, as I said, right? For man, the human being also has a function, okay? And the phrasing here is human good, right? Turns out to be precisely activity of a soul, remember the psyche, okay, in accordance with virtue, right? So this is, in other words, what ultimately the path, if you will, to happiness is, which is an ethical situation, but it is also political insofar as Aristotle says that ethics is part of the political sciences, and actually still in book in chapter 7 of book 1 you find this very important, very famous, okay, statement by Aristotle, where you will find it's highlighted, right? But where he says, when he speaks about the final good is so to be self-sufficient, then he says, he gives the definition of the human being as a political animal, social political animal, okay. So the actually the phrasing that you have in your version of this is, and you will find it, since he says, since man is born for citizenship, okay, since man is born for citizenship. But pay attention, because this is really what Aristotle otherwise right says, that basically, I hope this is clear, okay, that the correct understanding of this is precisely to say that the human being is a political animal, okay, by nature. You can think about what this means, elaborate on this, but this is very important, okay. The human being is a naturally political animal, meaning that we cannot not be political, right? To be political, I can't elaborate much on this now, but it is a part of our humanity or humanness, okay. So you can think about what this means. Actually, let me see what I ask you to, and make sure that you do write your discussion board entry. That's very important, okay. For this week, it would be, precisely what is Aristotle's idea of happiness, right? So read book 1, you will find out, use some of the things I said. I hope they're clear, they help. And then, actually, I ask precisely what is the importance of the human function, okay? So say something about this. You can also, if you choose, to speak about another aspect of book 1 or 2 of the ethics, Aristotle's ethics, you can do so, as always. Just say what you're doing, right? But make sure that you do write something, and then there would be much more to say, even about book 1 of the ethics. But I want to perhaps briefly, and then I will continue next week, say something about book 2 that you start reading this week and then continue next time, okay? Because basically book 2 will be on the question of virtue, excellence, virtue of character, character. Okay, the character that we have is, of course, for Aristotle, constructed by us, right? I mean, not in a vacuum, in circumstances that often are not of our own making, but we still have some agency, right? We can do something, right? There is something that is remains within our power. We have to focus on that. There are other things that are not in our power, and so we will see that in book 3 also, when Aristotle will then speak about deliberation and decision. But in any case, what is this question of a character, or he says virtues. I hope that the concept of virtue is clear, right? I mean, the opposite of virtue is vice, V-I-C, right? And Aristotle says, you will find that, I will go back to this next time, but you will read that in book 2 of the Ethics. It's a great moment in the book, right? That there are two kinds of virtues of character, or what you find probably in your version of Aristotle, moral virtues. Okay, same idea. And then intellectual, or mental virtues, right? I mean, then there are different translations of this virtue of thought in the mind, mental, and virtue of a character, that must be practiced, must be put into practice, right? The moral virtue. And then we'll focus on that, because then he goes back later to virtues of thought or mental, right? Intellectual virtues, but we're not dealing with that type of virtue in particular, but with moral virtues, or virtues of, as I prefer, character. Okay, so the idea is, Aristotle will say, you will see at the beginning of book 2, these are not naturally given. I mean, they are not these virtues, right? I mean, to make an example, courage is seen, bravery is seen as a virtue, a good thing, a good trait of one's character. Okay, so they don't arise in us naturally. Okay, they are basically, we make them, we train, right? We activate, it's a matter of activation, a capacity that we have, right? The virtue, for example, the good trait of one's character, to be just rather than unjust. We spoke about just and unjust law. I can be just, I can be unjust, and so on and so forth, right? It is not something which is there to begin with. I become just or unjust, just like I become courageous or cowardly, or rash or reckless. Just Aristotle says, we make these virtues of our character, and ultimately our character, the same way in which we become speakers of any language whatsoever. If I study Spanish, at one point I will become a Spanish speaker. If I study Chinese, I will become a Chinese speaker. If I, or any other thing, if I play the violin, then I will become a violinist. Whether then I'll be a, that's a different question, whether I'll be a great or not that great, or mediocre, or whatever, violinist, right, musician. But insofar as I try my best, let's put it this way, then I bring whatever I do to the point of excellence. Okay, that's the point. But the important thing is to understand that these virtues, right, the moral virtues, the virtues of character, just like the other, skills that we might end up having, they are not there to begin with. So I am not a good person or a bad person because of some kind of genetic, right? I mean, makeup, but I become, right, depending on what I do. Then we will see more next week what that means, why I will, for example, take one course of actions or another, why I will perhaps activate one capacity rather than another, because this should be clear to everybody. I mean, I have the capacity, the twofold or manifold, but the twofold, let's say, capacity to be just and to be unjust. I can do just things or unjust things. If I always do or try to do, right? I mean, because intention is, in Aristotle, very important. If I do or try to do just actions, then at one point I will become just, right? A just person. If I always do unjust actions, then I will become unjust. Okay, so it's not a matter of being one way or the other to begin with, but it is rather a matter of becoming what we are. Okay, and I see it's already longer than usual, but I hope it's not too long for you. You know, I understand that this is a difficult time for everybody, and for some of us, some of you may be even more, difficult. The disruption of life at this time may actually have various degrees of intensity. So I hope you're all doing well. You know, keep in touch. I gave you my contact information, and also please do write these, okay, your assignments. Okay, so we'll continue next time with maybe a brief review. I hope I, gave you a sense of book one, and the beginning of book two. Then we will continue with book two of the ethics, and three, which is again about the question of voluntary, involuntary action, and then decision. You know what our agency, our our task again, to go back to the human function, which is central here, is might be okay. All right, thank you. Bye.